Today, we're going to unpack a case that sits at this really fascinating and frankly pretty troubling intersection of social media, academic freedom, and the power of the state.
And it all boils down to this one central question. It's about the strange and compelling case of Dr. Chen Jingwuorn, a physicist from China who studies complex systems. His story forces us to ask a really fundamental question. In this digital age, what actually counts as a crime?
All right, so first up, let's just lay out the official story. From the point of view of the Kunming Shishan District People's Court, this was a pretty clear-cut case. They saw an individual who was deliberately disrupting social order.
In fact, the court's verdict opened with this very stark warning, and it really sets the tone, doesn't it? It frames Dr. Chen, a man with a PhD in physics, not as a scholar sharing ideas, but as a criminal who should have known what he was doing.
And boy, the legal process moved fast. He was arrested in September 2022, and just 7 months later, he was sentenced to 20 months in prison. The system moved very, very decisively.
So the prosecution's argument was this. Dr. Chen used a VPN to spread what they called false remarks, and this caused chaos. The court totally agreed. But here's the key part, their reasoning. They specifically pointed to his high level of education, basically arguing that because he had a PhD, he absolutely should have known better. He should have known his actions were wrong and would cause all this disorder.
But of course, that is only one side of the story. From inside his prison cell, Dr. Chen put together a very detailed, really systematic defense, and he argued that the court's verdict was just fundamentally wrong.
In his appeal, he basically made two core arguments. First, he said the crime he was charged with legally requires that you know you're spreading lies and that you cause actual disorder. He argued neither of those things happened. And second, he said, hey, wait a minute, I'm being selectively prosecuted here. Thousands of people shared this exact same content, so why am I the only one ending up in prison?
So you can see this massive gap between the two stories, right? The court sees his malicious actor, using his intellect to stir up trouble. But Dr. Chen, he sees himself as a scholar who's being made an example of for doing something that, let's be honest, millions of people do online every single day.
Now, to even begin to understand how these two completely different realities can exist side by side, we have to zoom out and look at the law he was actually charged under. It's a statute that's famous for its flexibility. So flexible, in fact, that it's often called a pocket crime.
This crime, picking quarrels and provoking trouble, is notorious for being incredibly vague. And legal critics often point out that because the language is so ambiguous, it can be stretched to cover almost anything authorities don't like, from a fight in the street to, well, a tweet. It's like a pocket that can hold whatever you need it to hold at any given moment.
Okay, so to really get to the bottom of this, we need to bring in a couple of powerful ideas. One comes from legal theory, and the other from the philosophy of language. The first idea is something called legal positivism. Now, it makes a really important distinction. It says that a law can be perfectly valid within a legal system, even if we personally think that law is unfair or unjust. Basically, a bad law can still be the law.
The second tool is what philosophers call a semantic category mistake. This is just a fancy term for a simple error in classification. It's like asking, what color is the number 7? It doesn't make sense. Or, more to the point here, it's like treating a piece of art, something that expresses an emotion or an idea, as if it's a scientific report that you can fact-check for truth or falsehood.
And that brings us right back to the heart of this entire case. Can a symbolic cartoon, or a post that just expresses an emotion, or an academic paper that puts forward a theory, can any of these things really be labeled false information? Is a cartoon a lie?
All right, so now that we have these tools, let's zoom back in and really put the court's claims to the test.
So check this out. There is a huge factual disconnect here. The court's entire case was built on the idea that Dr. Chen caused serious public disorder. But an analysis of his actual Twitter account showed he had fewer than 100 followers, and the engagement on his posts, it was, and this is a direct quote, almost approximate to zero. Zero. So how exactly do you cause serious chaos with almost zero engagement?
And this is just a perfect example of that semantic category mistake we were talking about. The court took all these different kinds of expression, art, emotion, theory, even history, and just lumped them all into one box labeled false information. They were judging a symbolic cartoon by the same standards as a factual news report, and that's just a fundamental misclassification of what these things even are.
So what happened in the end? Well, Dr. Chen's appeal failed.
And after that final rejection, his tone changed dramatically. He went from making this reasoned, scholarly defense to just outright defiance.
On New Year's Day 2024, he wrote a letter from prison, and in it, he declared he would never admit to the so-called crime. He wasn't even addressing the officials as part of the legal system anymore. Instead, he accused them of being a corrupt, evil, cult and gang criminal group.
And that's where this case leaves us. The story of Dr. Chen Jingyuan really shows how a law that is technically valid can, through vague language and selective enforcement, lead to a verdict that seems completely disconnected from any real-world factual evidence of harm. And it forces us all to confront this deeply unsettling question about the nature of justice. If the law is supposed to be a system of rules that protects us, what happens when the rules themselves become the weapon?